6 months ago, a gentleman called Fidel Castro passed from this earth. When the news broke that he had died, the Washington Examiner ran an article attacking the cluelessness of those who were praising him. And without specifically mentioning our own President Michael D's praise of Castro, the opening sentence of the Washington Examiner reminded leaders that at the time, a previous Irish president, Douglas Hyde, expressed condolences over the death of Adolf Hitler. An American newspaper used that incident and tied it by themselves, tied it in with the gushing reviews and praise being showered on Castro. And in Ireland too, social media linked Michael D's praise of Castro to the occasion when an Irish head of state caused controversy by expressing condolences on the death of an even bigger monster than Fidel Castro. The first anyone knew about the condolence visit paid by Taoiseach and Minister for External Affairs, Eamon de Valera, to the German legation came on the 3rd of May 1945. Under the heading People and Places, the Irish press reported briefly that Dev, accompanied by his aide, the Secretary of External Affairs, Joseph Walsh, called on Dr. Hempel, the German minister, last evening to express his condolences on the death of the German head of state. The head of state in question was none other than Adolf Hitler, who had committed suicide, as Hillary said, on the 30th of April 1945 in his Berlin bunker. The day after Dev's condolence visit, Michael McDumphy, the secretary of President Douglas Hyde, did the same. And McDumphy said, after consultation with the government and acting on the authority of the president, I called today on the German minister, Herr Eduard Hempel, at the legation in Northumberland Road, and on behalf of the president expressed condolences on the death of the Führer and Chancellor of the German Reich. And for years, historians have tried to make sense of these condolence visits. Why would official Ireland have felt the need to pay their respects to this monster? Or what kind of twisted interpretation of protocol required the Irish head of state to express condolences on the death of another head of state who had perpetrated genocide and mass murder, by consistently refusing to make any moral distinction between Nazis and anti-Nazis? Were de Valera and others in Ireland guilty of downplaying the systematic genocidal nature of the entire Nazi project? We know that de Valera was clinically blind, but was this blindness so acute that he failed to see that his condolence visit would only strengthen international public opinion's image of Ireland as a narrow-minded theocracy out of step with the defeat of Nazism? And was this blindness so acute that de Valera failed to see that Irish neutrality was interpreted by the Western powers as nothing more than a mask for pro-Axis sentiments? So in attempting to explain what propelled de Valera to take this extraordinary step, we have to acknowledge that he was walking a political tightrope. He knew that there were indeed pro-Axis and anti-Semitic sentiments among some sections of Irish society. For example, at a pro-Franco rally in Cork in September 1936, 40,000 people heard Monsignor Patrick Sexton blame the Spanish Civil War on a gang of murderous Jews in Moscow. Of course. Standing next to Sexton on the platform was the future president of the Irish state, Douglas Hyde, who uttered not a word in protest at this grotesque accusation. Cardinal Joseph McRory, the man who suggested to Owen O'Duffy that he raise an Irish brigade to aid Franco, assured US Ambassador David Gray in 1940 that Hitler would win the war. The former Lord Mayor of Dublin, Paddy Doyle, also told Gray, "At the beginning of the war we were all sure Germany was going to win." De Valera himself remarked in late 1941, "I wish there was some way of knowing who will win the war. It would make decisions much easier." Note that de Valera said nothing about right and wrong, nothing about morality, just what will make it easier for the Irish government to make decisions. When Deputy Oliver J. Flanagan praised Hitler in the Dáil in 1943 for ridding Germany of the Jews, there was not a peep from either the government or opposition benches. Deputy J.J. Walsh, a minister in the Cosgrave government, described Irish Jews as a gang of parasites. Again, not a peep of protest. Walsh's gang of parasites, on the other hand, had no illusions about the Nazi threat. David Marcus, the famous literary figure, recalled that during World War II, his family slept with packed suitcases in case the Nazis defeated Britain and would come for the Jews of Ireland. That's cheap. Ireland's wartime policy of neutrality did not go down well with the Allies. 1943, de Valera displayed a warped sense of morality when he congratulated Indian nationalist and German and Japanese ally, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, Subhash Chandra Bose. Bose, thank you. Following his declaration of a free India government in exile. 1944, de Valera turned down a Roosevelt's request to expel the German legation from Ireland. When de Valera made his infamous condolence visit to the German legation, he and the Irish cabinet knew exactly what atrocities the Nazis had committed. Listen to what Frank Aiken, the wartime minister for the coordination of defensive measures, said in a 1979 interview. "What was going on in the camps was pretty well known to us early on. But the Russians were as bad. You only have to look at what happened in Katyn Forest." So in Irish eyes, the godless Russians murdering 13,000 Polish Catholic officers had the same moral weight as the Nazi genocide of 6 million Jews. It was the job of the wartime controller of censorship here to make sure that spiritual Ireland would stand above the ungodly struggle between powers pursuing their own materialist interests. In 1943, the German ambassador Edward Hempel complained about an upcoming production in Dublin's Peacock Theatre called The Refugee, which featured a Jewish refugee from Nazi Austria. Bending over backwards to appease Hempel, the controller of censorship demanded amendments to the script, including the removal of any reference to Nazis or concentration camps. So on opening night in April 1943, special branch detectives were in the Peacock to check that the hero had become simply a refugee from Hungary. So successful was Ireland's narrow focus on a legalistic view of the war, that when censorship was finally lifted in May 1945, there was little moral outrage at the revelations of Nazi war crimes. Why? Because the public simply did not believe in reports of Nazi atrocities. And when footage from Bergen-Belsen was shown on Pathé News in the cinemas, it was dismissed as British propaganda. It almost beggars belief that a reader wrote to a Kilkenny paper alleging that starving Indians had impersonated the concentration camp inmates. A Dublin doctor assured the Irish Times that all the evidence, descriptions and pictures from Belsen could quite simply be accounted for by a typhoid epidemic. Prevailing attitudes in Ireland at the time can be gauged from the fact that the Meath Chronicle chose to run an editorial that lauded the lives of, and I quote, three great statesmen, Roosevelt, Mussolini and Hitler. In such an atmosphere, we should not be surprised that so many war criminals found permanent or temporary refuge in post-war Ireland, and that Ireland served as an escape route for German, Breton, Belgian and Croatian fascists. And this atmosphere maybe also explains the vehement official opposition in Ireland to the Nuremberg Nazi war trials. Gerald Boland, the wartime Minister for Justice, would later say that those responsible for atrocities such as Katyn, again, Dresden, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had a, and I quote, a cheek to try anyone for war crimes. Fixated on its anti-British rhetoric and notwithstanding the global revulsion against the now revealed Nazi atrocities, the Irish government declared that Nuremberg trials were illegal. Ireland claimed that the Allies had no right to try military and political leaders for actions taken during wartime. Why? Because there was no statute in law at the time the crimes were committed. So in this warped universe, Ireland was saying that genocide was not yet a crime during World War II, so don't prosecute the Nazi war criminals. Let's return to the consequences of Dev's visit to Herr Hempel. In Madrid, the Irish envoy Leopold Kearney called on the German embassy to express his condolences, and he received the following message from the German chargé d'affaires. I know the admiration always felt by the Führer for Ireland and our history, and I am sure that his death for the liberty of his people will also be understood by the Irish people. Kearney also received a letter from a former Spanish foreign minister. The brave Christian and human attitude of de Valera moves me to write these lines to express to you my admiration for your country and to assure you again of my friendship. Kearney also received a letter from a former Spanish ambassador to Berlin. The sympathy which both as a Spaniard and a Catholic I always felt for the noble people that you represent has continually increased during the war before the Christian and dignified attitude of its government. Today, in the presence of the noble gesture of Mr. de Valera, I desire to manifest to your Excellency my admiration and respect. Fortunately for Ireland's tattered reputation, letters of gratitude from fascists remained unpublished for many years. Here's a letter that Kearney received from the UK, and I love this one. The British Union of Fascists begs of your Excellency to convey its gratitude to the government of ERA for thus honouring the memory of the greatest German in history. US Ambassador to Ireland David Gray, who suspected that certain Irish officials were collaborating with the Nazis, was not a fan of de Valera. He would later write, Mr. de Valera's conviction that Hitler would win the war was stupid in view of the opportunities he enjoyed for obtaining authoritative information as to what was going on in the United States. It was doubtless due to the fact that he knew few, if any, Americans, only Irish in America. That's a very interesting comment about de Valera's not being able to gauge anything about sentiment in the United States. Gray described the condolence visit as a studied affront to the United Nations by the Irish government. And it was the British ambassador, Sir John Maffey, the British ambassador to Dublin, who suggested to Grey that an effective form of protest against the condolence visit might be the joint withdrawal of British and American diplomatic representatives from Dublin. And even though Grey informed his masters in Washington that any joint breaking of diplomatic relations would only enhance the Valera's reputation, an early draft of the State Department's response to Grey declared that the de Valera condolence visit will not readily be forgotten. The idea of withdrawing the US ambassador from Ireland was eventually discussed at the highest level by President Truman. In Britain, the Under-Secretary of State for Dominion Affairs remarked that de Valera should be left to realise for himself the universal feeling of indignation which this action has aroused. Now, not every Irish representative abroad backed de Valera's action. The Irish High Commissioner in Britain, John Dullanty, declared himself appalled by the diplomatic lack of wisdom of the Irish government. Yet de Valera was not without his defenders. Various groups in Ireland tried to organise masses for the repose of the souls of Mussolini and Hitler. When Trinity College students raised the flags of the victorious Allies, including the Union Jack, a group of UCD students led by, anyone know the ringleader?
Charlie Hyde.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Charles J. Haughey burnt the British flag. The Irish government had to apologise to the US and British governments when a mob of youths carrying the Irish, Vatican and Nazi flags, I repeat, the Irish, Vatican and Nazi flags, what an unholy trinity, marched through Dublin on the 7th of May. 7th of May, this is the war is over, the day the Germans officially surrendered. George Bernard Shaw, I'm a great fan of George Bernard Shaw, he was an idiot, whose own muddled thinking had led him to become a Stalin apologist in the 30s, wrote to the Times, Eamon de Valera comes out of it as a champion of the Christian chivalry we are all pretending to admire. Let us recognise a noble heart, even if we must sometimes question its worldly wisdom. The New York Times reprinted Shaw's letter under the headline, Shaw hails de Valera for mourning Hitler. As late as 1979, Brian Lenihan Sr., who was Irish foreign minister, would describe Yasser Arafat as a moderate even while Arafat's thugs were murdering Israeli citizens, was still defending, this is 1979, de Valera's condolence visit. And he said, perhaps one day de Valera's observance of protocol in the case of the German ambassador, Dr. Hempel, will be understood as a far-sighted recognition of the inextinguishable rights of the German people as of any other people, even at their darkest hour. De Valera's action had been unique among the leaders of the Western democracies. Neither Switzerland nor Sweden had felt a need to emulate de Valera, who was left in the dubious company of the Iberian dictators Salazar of Portugal and Franco of Spain. But Dev remained impervious to the global diplomatic storm. In fact, he wrote to Robert Brennan, the Irish envoy in Washington, that he had expected that the condolence visit would cause a fuss. And I quote, I could have had a diplomatic illness, but as you know, I would scorn that sort of thing. So long as we retained our diplomatic relations with Germany, to have failed to call upon the German representative would have been an act of unpardonable discourtesy to the German nation and to Dr. Hempel himself, During the whole of the war, Dr. Hempel's conduct was irreproachable. He was always friendly and invariably correct, in marked contrast with Grey. I certainly was not going to add to his humiliation in the hour of defeat. Just listen to the language of Dev's blind obtuseness. Discourtesy to a country that sought to subjugate the whole world. German nation, in whose name the horrors of the Holocaust had been perpetrated. Irreproachable, talking about Hempel, a card-carrying Nazi party member who represented a foreign service that was knee-deep in anti-Semitic activities and atrocities. Humiliation, again talking about Hempel. Hempel's humiliation? What about the victims' humiliation? And listen to the praise of Hempel and the criticism of Grey. Correct behavior was far more important to Dev than morality. In the event, as we know, the USA and Britain never did carry out their threat to withdraw the ambassadors. However, the continuing sense of outrage can be gauged from a debate in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. One representative proposed to exclude from United Nations peace talks any neutral nation that had sent messages of condolence on Hitler's death. He couldn't be more explicit than that. There could be no misunderstanding who he was referring to. The US and Britain did, however, exact their retribution. Ireland applied to join the United Nations when it was formed in 1946. But for 12 years, the UK and the USA prevented Ireland from joining the world body. If the diplomatic response to de Valera's condolence visit was severe, the response of the international media was of unrestrained disgust, as reported by the Irish envoy Brennan in a cable dated May the 8th. Radio commentator announced item in bitter and caustic tone. Although similar action by Portugal is reported, Chief, that's talking about Dev of course, gets headlines in all papers seen, particularly because of horror atrocity stories of German prison camps during past months. Anti-German feeling was never so bitter as now. And in another cable, Brennan wrote, among general public, incident has attracted more attention than anything else arising from our neutrality. There is considerable adverse criticism among Irish. Headlines in major US newspapers portrayed de Valera as being pro-Axis and personally sympathetic to Hitler. Under the sardonic headline, Mr. de Valera's regrets, here is the New York Times editorial. De Valera may have merely been following what he believed to be the protocol required of a neutral state. Considering the character and the record of the man for whose death he was expressing grief, there is obviously something wrong with the protocol and the neutrality of Mr. de Valera. Under the headline, Neutrality Gone Mad, the Herald Tribune editorial said, despite the preoccupation with greater events, there is still time for a glance and a gasp at the spectacle of the Prime Minister of Era marching solemnly to the German legation to present his government's condolences on the death of Adolf Hitler, while the pious Dr. Salazar places the flags of Portugal at half-mast to mourn the passing of the enemy of the human race. If this is neutrality, continues the Herald article, it is neutrality gone mad. Neutrality carried into a diplomatic jungle where good and evil alike vanish in the red tape thickets, where conscience flounders helplessly in slogans of protocol, and there is no sustenance for the spirit but mouldy forms of desiccated ceremonies. Continues, obviously for all the colourless connotations of the word, neutrality can go rancid when it is kept too long. Under the headline, Moral Myopia, the Washington Post editorial wrote, "Can it be that the moral myopia they imposed upon themselves in the face of danger has now blinded them to all ethical values? Or is it merely that a preoccupation with protocol has atrophied their emotions?" Canada's Toronto Telegram went even further, hinting that had the war gone differently, de Valera might have become another Laval, the Vichy French Prime Minister who collaborated with the Nazis. Among the Irish diaspora in the USA, there was total incomprehension. A shocked Irish-American woman, Angela D. Walsh, wrote to the press, "Have you seen the motion pictures of the victims of German concentration camps, de Valera? Have you seen the crematoriums? Have you seen the bodies of little children murdered by Nazi hands? Have you seen the living dead, de Valera? Skin stretched over bone and too weak to walk?" And she wrote directly to de Valera, and she said, "I am horrified, ashamed, humiliated. You who are the head of a Catholic country have now shown allegiance to a devil." Teresa S. Fitzpatrick also wrote to de Valera, "I cannot believe that you, a Roman Catholic, a humanitarian, a man who, like all of Ireland, respects the sacredness of a woman's person above all, could have expressed regret at the death of a man who violated every code of decency." And as Professor Dermot Coe writes, de Valera's condolence visit strengthened the image abroad of de Valera as a narrow-minded nationalist clinging to his Celtic ideology at a moment when democracy had been saved from Nazism. I'm hiding the sound.
It's yours, isn't it?
No, it's not. No, mine's not. De Valera's model ambivalence regarding the fight between the Allies and the Nazis extended to the 60,000 Irish citizens who fought in the British Army, Navy and Air Force during World War II. Persistent bugger.
Well done.
After the war, the Irish government permitted US military personnel to wear their uniforms in public, and some of you may remember that the Irish government refused to extend the same right to those in British uniforms. De Valera introduced special legislation to deprive Irish soldiers who had fought for the Allies of various rights for 7 years. In 2013, Defence Minister Alan Shatter redressed this injustice by issuing an amnesty and apology. Here's what he said. "Tens of thousands of Irish people put their lives at risk during World War II in the fight against fascism and tyranny. They included approximately 5,000 members of our defence forces who absented themselves without leave or permission. And when they returned to Ireland at the end of the war, they were treated shamefully by the state despite their bravery. They were essentially treated as outcasts. For too long," said Shatter, "Irish neutrality during the Second World War was praised as a high moral principle worthy of support and praise. But the reality was," he said, "that Irish neutrality had more to do with hostility to the British government than with morality. Following Hitler's death," said Shatter, "Ireland was essentially closed to the surviving remnants of European Jewry, save for a very small number of individuals." And he said, "We should no longer be in denial that in the context of the Holocaust, Irish neutrality was a principle of moral bankruptcy." Ladies and gentlemen, we've spoken about the condolence visit. We've spoken about de Valera's definition of neutrality. We've spoken about Ireland's moral ambiguity. So how do we explain de Valera's stand on the 1935 Italian invasion of Abyssinia? De Valera was president of the League of Nations Council. when it determined that Italy had broken Articles 12 and 16 by resorting to war. Dev made a radio broadcast to the Irish nation, in which he openly backed collective military action, intimating that Ireland might join a League of Nations war against Italy in defense of Ethiopia. So strident was the Valera that Anthony Eden, Britain's representative at the League, described him as a firebrand. 3 years earlier, Dev had similarly threatened military action against Japan for invading Manchuria. He said then, no state should be permitted to jeopardize the common interest by selfish action contrary to the covenant, League of Nations covenant. Dev also considered dispatching several hundred Irish soldiers to the Saarland on the Franco-German border in the winter of 1934 and 1935 to help oversee a plebiscite on the status of the territory under League of Nations auspices. So here's my question. Why was the Valera willing to actively fight against Japan and Italy, to send troops to the Saarland, while refusing ever to brand Hitler as an aggressor, even after Nazi Germany's intervention in the Spanish Civil War, Nazi Germany's takeover of Austria, the Anschluss, Nazi Germany's taking over and dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, and Nazi Germany's attack on Poland? I do not have an answer to these questions. How does the Valera's reaction to Hitler's death compare with his reaction to Roosevelt's death and later Churchill's death? He did indeed call a dawn sitting when Roosevelt died. But he only spoke of Roosevelt's plans for a world organization that would save humanity from recurring calamities like the present war. De Valera spoke of calamities, but not a word of moralities, even though he already knew of the Nazi final solution, courtesy of Ireland's Directorate of Military Intelligence, G2, which was privy to information about what was going on from the beginning. When Churchill died, January 1965, de Valera did not extend the same courtesy to Churchill as he did with Hitler. When Hitler committed suicide, de Valera had said that it would have been an act of unpardonable discourtesy to the German nation were he not to pay a condolence visit. All he could bring himself to say about Churchill was that he was a great Englishman, but we in Ireland had to regard him over a long period as a dangerous adversary. So, Churchill was a dangerous adversary, Hitler wasn't. Did de Valera not know that his friend Dr. Hempel must have been involved in preparing Unternehmen Grün, Operation Green, Germany's 5-volume contingency plan for invading Ireland? The plan included detailed sketches of 233 cities, towns and villages across Ireland, street maps of 25 cities and towns, the addresses of garage owners, high-altitude aerial surveillance photographs with houses and trees visible. The plan included comprehensive details of the Ardnacrusha power station on the Lower Shannon, and these details, of course, were supplied by Siemens, the German company that had built the power station. And as part of Operation Green, 50,000 German troops would have landed on Ireland's southeast coast, Irish cities would have been bombed, and Ireland's political elite would have been decapitated. And in the event of a German invasion, how would de Valera have responded to the 4,000 Irish Jews earmarked for slaughter by the 1942 Wannsee Conference? Now, notwithstanding all that I have said, it would be wrong to ignore the fact that de Valera's strange definition of neutrality still allowed him to clandestinely support the Allied cause. And while Ireland's neutral stance probably helped to bind the country together during the war, it also blinded the country to the evils of Nazism, a blindness that persists in some circles to this day. De Valera convinced himself that the future of Ireland depended on staying out of the global conflict, ignoring the evidence of Hitler's disdain for other small independent nations like Belgium, Holland and Denmark. I want to share an anecdote I heard from Mary Benotti. Soon after she was first elected an MEP, 1984, she attended a function in Brussels where Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel, whom Benotti had never heard of, was the guest of honor. A colleague schlepped Benotti along to meet Wiesel. Mr. Wiesel, I want to introduce to you Mary Benotti, an Irish MEP. Wiesel looked at her and he said, "From Ireland? Ah, yes. Your Prime Minister expressed condolences on the death of Hitler." Benotti's shock was twofold. First, of course, she'd never heard of the condolence visit. It doesn't exactly feature in mainstream Irish history books. And two, she could not believe that in international Jewish circles, Ireland and the word Irish were defined by de Valera's shameful condolence visit on the death of one of history's greatest mass murderers. And I heard her relate this story in person. I want to close with some observations based on my almost 20 years on the Emerald Isle. My experience is that there is still something warped in the attitudes of some people here in relation to the Nazis. When a Dundalk school teacher thinks it is acceptable to tell a joke with Auschwitz as the punchline, there is something warped. When an Italian restaurant proudly displays a picture of Mussolini, there is something warped. When a Sinn Féin TD dares to mention Goebbels in an attack on the Israeli ambassador in a Dáil subcommittee, there is definitely something warped. When bog-ignorant Irishmen on a stag party to Prague think it is acceptable to put on Hitler masks, there is something warped. When immediately after World War II the Irish government welcomed hundreds of German children in Operation Shamrock, but consistently refused requests to allow Holocaust child survivors to even come to recuperate in Ireland, there is something warped. And when an Irish woman in her 60s tells 21st century Israeli tourists in a Dublin museum that they should have been burnt in the Nazi crematoria, there is something warped. And I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that this same warped attitude lay behind Valera's amoral and infamous condolence visit. Thank you very much.